Hello everyone, welcome to my channel.
I'm Ainsley, 34, and I thought the worst part of my day would be burying my husband. I was wrong. My sister Clara walked up to me at the cemetery, holding her 2-year-old son, and announced to everyone within earshot, "This boy is your husband's child, so I'll be claiming his father's inheritance." I just stood there in my black dress, dirt still fresh on David's grave, and said, "That's interesting." Then I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing, because my husband couldn't have children, ever. And Clara had no idea I knew that. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely betrayed by family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. The thing about family betrayal is that it never comes when you're prepared for it. It comes when you're already down, already broken, already wondering how you're going to survive the next hour. Clara had perfect timing, I'll give her that. David and I had been married for 8 years. 8 beautiful, complicated, sometimes frustrating years with a man who made me laugh even when I wanted to strangle him. He died in a car accident on a Tuesday morning, completely out of nowhere. One moment he was kissing me goodbye, complaining about his early meeting, and the next moment I was getting a phone call that changed everything. The funeral was everything David would have hated. Too formal, too many flowers, too many people who barely knew him pretending to be devastated. But that's what you do when someone dies unexpectedly at 36. You have the funeral that makes everyone else feel better, not the one that honors the person you lost. I was standing by his casket, still in shock, when I saw Clara approaching. She'd been different lately, more present, more supportive. When David died, she'd been one of the first people to call. She'd helped with arrangements, brought food, handled relatives. I thought maybe, finally, we'd grown up enough to be real sisters. She was carrying little Michael, her son who'd just turned 2, beautiful kid with dark curls and those big eyes that made everyone melt. I'd been there when he was born, held Clara's hand through labor, cut the umbilical cord when she was too exhausted. I loved that boy like he was my own nephew, which I thought he was. "Ainsley," Clara said, her voice carrying across the crowd. People turned to look. "I need to tell you something important. About Michael, about David." I should have known right then. Clara never did anything quietly, never handled family business privately. She was always about the audience, always about the drama, but I was grieving, not thinking clearly, so I just nodded and waited. "This boy," she said, lifting Michael higher so everyone could see him, "is David's son. We had an affair that lasted over a year. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. But now that David's gone, I have to do what's right for my child. I'll be claiming Michael's rightful inheritance." The cemetery went completely silent. I could feel every eye on me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to fall apart, to scream, to make a scene. My mother gasped. David's parents looked horrified. His brothers stepped closer, probably thinking they'd need to catch me when I collapsed. But all I could think about was what David told me 3 years into our marriage, when we'd been trying to have children and nothing was working. We'd been to specialist after specialist, and finally, one doctor looked at David's medical history and asked about a childhood surgery he'd had when he was 7. "I need to tell you something," David had said that night, holding my hands. "When I was a kid, I had complications from that surgery. It left me sterile, completely. I've known since I was 15, but I never told anyone. Not my parents, not my brothers. Nobody. I was too embarrassed. We'd gotten second opinions, third opinions. We'd spent thousands of dollars hoping someone, somewhere, would tell us we were wrong. But every single doctor confirmed the same thing. David could not father children. It was medically impossible. Standing there at his funeral, watching my sister manipulate a crowd of grieving people, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Because for the first time in our complicated relationship, Clara had finally given me ammunition she didn't know I had. People always ask me when I first realized Clara wasn't the sister I thought she was. The answer is when I was 15 and she was 17, and she told our entire family I was sleeping with her boyfriend. I wasn't. I'd never even been alone with Tommy Morrison, much less kissed him. But Clara had seen us talking at a school football game, and somehow, in her mind, that conversation became a torrid affair that explained why Tommy had been acting distant with her lately. The truth was, Tommy had been distant because Clara was exhausting to date. She needed constant attention, constant validation, constant drama. She'd call him crying about imaginary slights from other girls, accuse him of flirting when he said hello to female classmates, and generally make his life miserable. But admitting that would have required Clara to look at her own behavior, and that wasn't something she was capable of. It was easier to blame me. "I can't believe my own sister would do this to me," she'd sobbed at the dinner table. with all the theatrical flair of someone who'd been practicing in the mirror. She's been flirting with Tommy for weeks. Everyone at school is talking about it. My parents looked at me like I'd committed murder. Not because they believed I was capable of stealing my sister's boyfriend, but because family loyalty was supposed to be absolute in our house. You didn't betray each other, even if you weren't actually betraying each other. Ainsley, my father said in that disappointed voice that still makes my stomach clench. Is this true? No, I said. I talked to Tommy for maybe 5 minutes about our history assignment. That's it. See? Clara wailed. She's lying to your faces. She's been trying to break us up since day one because she's jealous that I have a boyfriend and she doesn't. The unfairness of it was breathtaking. I was 15, awkward, and more interested in books than boys. I had no desire to steal anyone's boyfriend, especially not Tommy Morrison, who seemed nice enough but couldn't hold a conversation about anything more complex than football scores. But Clara was beautiful, popular, and crying. I was the younger sister with frizzy hair and too many opinions. Guess who they believed? I was grounded for 2 months. Clara got sympathy and a new dress to help her feel better after her heartbreak. Tommy, confused by the whole thing, broke up with Clara the following week and started dating Jennifer Walsh, who had the good sense to stay away from our family drama. That should have been the end of it. But Clara never let anything go. For the rest of high school, she'd bring up my betrayal whenever she needed to deflect from her own problems. Failed a test? Well, she'd been too upset about my dishonesty to study. Got caught sneaking out? She'd been so hurt by family drama that she'd needed to get away and think. It became our family mythology. Clara was the victim, and I was the sister who couldn't be trusted. The pattern continued through college. When Clara flunked out sophomore year, it was because she'd been too emotional about our complicated relationship to focus on academics. When she couldn't hold down a job after graduation, it was because the stress of our unresolved issues was affecting her mental health. My parents ate it up. Clara was sensitive, artistic, wounded by life. I was practical, stable, maybe a little cold. Clara needed protection and support. I needed to be more understanding, more forgiving, more willing to let the past go. Your sisters, my mother would say whenever I expressed frustration. Family is forever. You need to learn to forgive. But forgiveness requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and Clara never admitted to doing anything wrong. In her version of events, she was always the victim of circumstances, other people's jealousy, or my inexplicable hostility toward her. When I started dating seriously in college, Clara would find ways to insert herself into my relationships. Not overtly, not obviously, but she'd call when she knew I had dates, claiming family emergencies that required immediate attention. She'd show up at parties and somehow manage to monopolize conversations with whoever I was interested in. She'd share embarrassing stories about me under the guise of being a loving, concerned sister. Ainsley's always been a little intense, she'd say with a laugh that sounded affectionate, but felt like a knife. She gets so serious about everything. I worry she scares guys away. One by one, relationships would fizzle out. Not dramatically, not with arguments or breakups, but with guys who suddenly seemed less interested, less available, less invested. I started to wonder if there was something wrong with me, if I really was too intense, too serious, too difficult. It wasn't until I met David that I understood what had been happening. David was older, more confident, and completely unimpressed by Clara's particular brand of manipulation. When she tried her usual tactics, he'd politely redirect conversations back to me, or simply ignore her obvious attempts to undermine me. Your sister's interesting, he said after meeting Clara for the first time. Very performing. It's like she's always on stage. That's exactly what it was like. Clara was always performing, always working an angle, always positioning herself as the star of whatever drama was unfolding. And for years, I'd been her unwilling supporting cast, playing the role of the sister who just didn't understand her, didn't appreciate her, didn't love her enough. But David saw through all of it, and Clara hated him for it. She tried to warn me away from him, suggesting he was too controlling, too serious, too old for me. When that didn't work, she tried to befriend him, calling with long stories about her problems and asking for his advice. When he politely deflected those calls back to me, she accused him of trying to isolate me from my family. He's changing you, she told me right before David and I got engaged. You used to care about family. Now all you care about is him. What she meant was that I'd stopped enabling her drama. I'd stopped dropping everything to manage her crises. I'd stopped accepting blame for problems I didn't create. David had shown me what a healthy relationship looked like. And by comparison, everything about my dynamic with Clara looked twisted and wrong. But I thought we'd grown past all of that. I thought maybe, finally, Clara had matured enough to be a real sister instead of a professional victim. I thought wrong. 3 years ago, Clara knocked on my door at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, crying and pregnant. I almost didn't recognize her. Gone were the carefully styled hair and designer clothes that had defined her since high school. She looked thin, exhausted, and genuinely scared in a way I'd never seen before. When I opened the door, she collapsed into my arms like a child. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying. "I know I don't deserve your help, but I didn't know where else to go." David was out of town on business, so it was just me and Clara in my living room, with her ultrasound pictures scattered across my coffee table like evidence of a miracle I hadn't expected. 6 weeks pregnant, no partner in sight, and according to Clara, no family support. "Mom and Dad don't know yet," she admitted, wiping her nose with the tissue I'd given her. "I'm too scared to tell them. You know how they feel about unwed mothers. Our parents were traditional, religious, and very concerned with what other people thought. An unmarried pregnant daughter would not fit their image of the perfect family they'd worked so hard to maintain." Clara was right to be scared. "What about the father?" I asked gently. Clara's face crumpled again. "He's married. I didn't know when we started. I thought he lied to me about everything. When I told him about the baby, he said I needed to handle it quietly. He gave me money and told me never to contact him again." I believed her. The Clara I knew was many things. Dramatic, manipulative, self-centered, but she wasn't a homewrecker. She was more likely to be the other woman who genuinely thought she was the only woman. The one who believed whatever lies a married man told her to keep her satisfied with scraps of attention. "I can't raise a baby alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have a career. I don't have savings. I don't have anything. I've been working at that boutique, but they're already cutting my hours. I can't even afford my rent next month." It was true. Clara had never managed to build the kind of stable life that would support a child. She'd bounced between jobs, apartments, and relationships for years, always confident that something better was just around the corner. The pregnancy had forced her to confront the reality that nothing better was coming, and she wasn't prepared for it. "What do you need?" I asked. "I need my sister back," she said, looking at me with an expression so vulnerable it broke my heart. "I know I've been terrible to you. I know I've been jealous and petty and probably impossible to deal with, but I'm going to be a mother. Ainsley, I want to be better than I've been." We talked until 3 in the morning. Clara told me about the therapy she'd started, the books on child development she'd been reading, the job interview she had lined up at a more stable company. She showed me a notebook where she'd been tracking her expenses, trying to figure out how to make a budget work on a single income. She apologized. Actually apologized without deflecting blame or making excuses. She acknowledged the pain she'd caused me over the years, the relationships she'd sabotaged, the trust she'd broken. It was the conversation I'd wanted to have with my sister for 15 years. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," she said, "but I'm hoping maybe we can start over. Maybe I can prove to you that I'm not the same person I used to be." David came home the next morning to find Clara asleep on our couch and me making breakfast for 3. I'd expected him to be frustrated, maybe even angry that I'd made a unilateral decision to involve us in Clara's drama. Instead, he listened quietly while I explained the situation, then helped me carry coffee to the living room where Clara was just waking up. "Congratulations," he said simply. "When are you due?" "For the next 7 months. Clara was the sister I'd always wanted. She called regularly, but not obsessively. She asked for advice, but didn't demand that I solve her problems. She got the job she'd interviewed for and kept it, working steadily through her pregnancy, despite morning sickness that lasted well into her 2nd trimester. When she needed help, and she did need help with medical bills and maternity clothes and preparing for a baby on a limited budget, she asked directly instead of manipulating circumstances to force my involvement. When I offered assistance, she accepted gracefully and always tried to reciprocate however she could. She painted my bathroom while I was at work, organized my closet, and cooked dinner for David and me at least once a week during her 3rd trimester. Small gestures, but meaningful ones that showed she was thinking about our relationship as something reciprocal instead of one-sided. Most importantly, she stopped performing. When she was happy, she showed it genuinely. When she was scared about becoming a mother, she admitted it honestly. When she was frustrated with the physical discomfort of pregnancy, she complained without making it anyone else's fault or responsibility. I was there when Michael was born. Clara had asked me to be her labor coach, and I'd agreed despite my complete lack of experience with childbirth. For 14 hours, I held her hand, fed her ice chips, and helped her breathe through contractions that made her grip my fingers so hard I thought she might break them. When Michael finally arrived, tiny and perfect and screaming his outrage at the world, Clara looked at me with tears streaming down her face and said, "Thank you for believing I could change." I was crying too, not just because of the miracle of birth, but because I finally had my sister back. The real Clara, the one I'd glimpsed sometimes when we were children, before jealousy and competition and family dysfunction had twisted our relationship into something unrecognizable. For 2 years, it was everything I'd hoped for. Clara was a devoted mother, a reliable employee, and a sister who actually acted like she cared about me as a person instead of just what I could do for her. We had dinner together once a week. We texted regularly. We even took a weekend trip together when Michael was 18 months old, just the three of us, and it was perfect. Michael was a joy, one of those babies who smiled early and laughed often and made everyone around him happier just by existing. Clara would bring him to family gatherings, and I loved watching him discover the world. Loved seeing Clara's face light up when he reached new milestones. I bought him clothes, toys, books. I babysat when Clara had work commitments or needed a break. I started a college fund for him, contributing monthly, because I wanted him to have opportunities Clara and I hadn't had. I imagined being the aunt who taught him to ride a bike, who helped with homework, who embarrassed him at high school graduation by crying too loudly. When David died, Clara was one of the few people who knew exactly what to do. She didn't offer platitudes or ask how I was holding up. She just showed up with practical help, groceries, a casserole, someone to handle phone calls from distant relatives who wanted details about the funeral arrangements. "Let me take care of this," she'd said. And for once, letting someone else take care of things felt like relief instead of defeat. I should have known it was too good to last. I should have remembered that Clara had never sustained positive change for more than a few months at a time. I should have been more suspicious of her sudden helpfulness, more protective of my own boundaries. But I'd wanted so desperately to believe that people could change, that family could heal, that love could overcome years of dysfunction and hurt. I'd wanted to believe that Clara's transformation was real, permanent, and motivated by genuine growth instead of temporary need. Standing at David's grave, listening to her destroy everything we'd built together, I realized that Clara hadn't changed at all. She'd just gotten better at hiding who she really was until she was in a position to use it against me. The thing about Michael is that I genuinely loved him. Still do, if I'm being honest. That might be the cruelest part of what Clara did. She used my love for her child as a weapon against me. From the moment he was born, Michael felt like family. Not just because he was my nephew, but because I'd been there for everything. His first smile, his first word, his first steps. I was the one who taught him to stack blocks, who read him bedtime stories when Clara was too exhausted, who sang him lullabies in the rocking chair I'd bought for his nursery. Clara encouraged it. More than encouraged it. She practically pushed Michael into my arms every chance she got. "You're so good with him," she'd say, watching me feed him or change his diaper or get him to stop crying when she couldn't. "He loves his Aunt Ainsley so much. Look how he calms down when you hold him." It was true. Michael and I had a connection from the very beginning. Maybe it was because I'd been there when he was born, or maybe it was because I approached him without Clara's anxiety and desperation to be the perfect mother. Whatever it was, he seemed to sense that I was a safe harbor in his small world. When he started talking, one of his first clear words was Annie, his baby pronunciation of Ainsley. Clara would clap and laugh and say, "Yes, that's your Annie. She loves you so much." I thought she was proud of our bond. I thought she was grateful that Michael had someone else who adored him, someone who could help carry the enormous responsibility of raising a child alone. I thought she was being generous, sharing her son with someone who couldn't have children of her own. David and I had stopped actively trying to get pregnant after his diagnosis, but that didn't mean I'd stopped wanting to be a mother. Having Michael in my life felt like a gift, a chance to experience that unconditional love and fierce protectiveness that comes with caring for a small person who depends on you completely. Clara knew all of this. She knew about David's condition, knew about our decision to stop pursuing fertility treatments, knew how much joy Michael brought to my otherwise childless life. She'd seen me cry when he took his first steps in my living room while she was in the kitchen making lunch. She'd watched me lie on the floor for hours, playing with blocks and reading the same book 17 times because that's what he wanted. "You'd make such a good mother," she'd told me more than once. "Michael is so lucky to have you as his aunt. Some kids don't have anyone besides their parents who really loves them, but he has you." I took that responsibility seriously. I made sure I was available whenever Clara needed help. I bought him everything he needed and plenty of things he didn't. I took pictures at every milestone and made sure he knew he was loved, wanted, celebrated. When Clara started hinting that she was struggling financially, I increased my contributions to his college fund and started buying groceries for their apartment. When she mentioned that childcare was expensive, I started taking him one evening a week so she could have adult time. When he outgrew his clothes faster than she could replace them, I took him shopping and let him pick out new outfits. None of it felt like sacrifice. It felt like what family did for each other. The first time I noticed Clara watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read was when Michael was about 18 months old. I was sitting on her living room floor, helping him build a tower with blocks, while she folded laundry nearby. He'd managed to stack 6 blocks before the tower toppled, and when it fell, he clapped and laughed like it was the most amazing thing that had ever happened. "Again! Annie, again!" he said, pushing the blocks toward me with his chubby little hands. I started rebuilding the tower, making exaggerated expressions of concentration that made him giggle. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Clara stop folding and just stare at us for a long moment. When I looked up, she was smiling, but something about her smile seemed forced. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," she said quickly, going back to the laundry. "Just tired." But I started noticing it more after that. The way Clara would watch when Michael ran to me instead of her when I arrived. The way her smile would tighten when he'd cry for Annie when she was trying to comfort him. The way she'd interrupt our games or suggest it was time for me to go home just when Michael and I were having the most fun. I told myself I was imagining things. Clara had been nothing but grateful for my involvement in Michael's life. She'd encouraged our bond from the beginning. She needed my help, and I was happy to give it. But looking back now, I wonder if that was when she started planning. When she realized that my love for Michael could be used against me, that my inability to have children made me vulnerable in a way she could exploit. Maybe she started watching David then too, looking for weaknesses, for opportunities, for ways to position herself as the victim of circumstances instead of the architect of them. Maybe she started building the story she'd eventually tell at his funeral, the one that would cast her as the wronged woman and me as the wife, too blind to see her husband's betrayal. Or maybe I'm giving her too much credit for long-term planning. Maybe Clara just saw an opportunity when David died and took it, the way she'd always taken opportunities that presented themselves. Maybe she looked at me, broken and grieving, and thought this was her chance to finally win whatever competition had been going on in her head since we were teenagers. Either way, she used Michael. She used my love for him, my inability to have children of my own, my desperation to believe that family could be more than dysfunction and disappointment. She turned my most vulnerable place into her weapon of choice. Standing in that cemetery, listening to her destroy my marriage and my husband's memory, I felt something I'd never felt before toward my sister. Not anger, not disappointment, not even betrayal. Hatred. Pure, clean hatred for someone who would use a child as ammunition in whatever twisted game she'd been playing our entire lives. Someone who would stand at a funeral and lie about a dead man to get money she hadn't earned and didn't deserve. But underneath the hatred was something else. Relief. Because finally, Clara had overplayed her hand. Finally, she'd told a lie I could prove was impossible. Finally, I could stop pretending she was anything other than exactly who she'd always been. The first phone call came 3 hours after the funeral. I was sitting in my kitchen, still wearing my black dress, staring at a casserole someone had brought and wondering how people expected you to eat when your world had just collapsed twice in one day. "Ainsley?" Clara's voice sounded tentative, almost nervous. "I know today was difficult. I know this is hard for you to process. Hard for me to process." Like I was struggling with basic comprehension instead of trying to figure out what kind of person announces a paternity claim at a funeral. "What do you want, Clara?" "I want us to handle this like adults, like family. I don't want to make this harder than it has to be." I almost laughed. She'd already made it as hard as possible by choosing the most public, most humiliating venue for her announcement. Everyone at that funeral would be talking about it for months. David's memory was now forever linked with adultery and scandal, and I was cast as the oblivious wife who'd been betrayed by her own sister. "How exactly do you want to handle this?" I asked. "Well, I was thinking we could work something out privately, without lawyers or courts or anything messy like that. I don't want to put Michael through a big legal battle." Of course. Clara wanted to avoid legal proceedings because legal proceedings required proof. They required documentation, evidence, facts that could be verified or disproven. Clara's specialty had always been emotional manipulation, not actual evidence. "What kind of arrangement are you thinking about? Maybe we could split David's life insurance? And the house? Well, Michael should inherit his father's house, don't you think? But I know you've been living there, so maybe we could work out some kind of timeline. My house." She wanted my house. The house David and I had bought together, renovated together, filled with 8 years of memories and furniture we'd chosen, and walls we'd painted, and a garden we'd planted. She wanted to take it away and give it to a child who wasn't even David's. "That's generous of you," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Giving me a timeline to move out of my own house. It's not your house anymore, Ainsley. It's Michael's house. David was his father." The certainty in her voice was almost impressive. She'd told this lie so many times in the 3 hours since the funeral that she'd started believing it herself. That was always Clara's gift. the ability to rewrite reality until her version became more real to her than what had actually happened. "We'll need to get a paternity test," I said. "That's not necessary. I mean, look at him, Ainsley. He looks just like David. Everyone's always said so. Had they?" I tried to remember anyone ever commenting on Michael's resemblance to David and came up empty. Michael was a beautiful child with dark hair and brown eyes, but so were a lot of children. I'd never seen any particular similarity to David, who'd been blonde with green eyes. "If he's David's son, you shouldn't have any problem proving it," Clara sighed, and I could practically hear her switching tactics. "Fine, if that's what it takes for you to believe me. But I'm not putting Michael through some traumatic legal process just because you can't accept reality." "What reality is that?" "That your husband had an affair with your sister. That he got me pregnant. That he's been lying to you for over 2 years. Each word was designed to hurt, to make me doubt everything I thought I knew about my marriage. And if I hadn't known what I knew, it might have worked. Clara was good at finding pressure points and applying just enough force to make people question themselves. "When did this affair supposedly happen?" "It started when I was pregnant. You were so busy with work, so unavailable, and David was lonely. I was vulnerable, dealing with being abandoned by Michael's real father, and David was supportive." The timeline was clever. My pregnancy support of Clara, reframed as David's opportunity for infidelity. My work commitments, which had been necessary to support both my household and Clara's expenses during her pregnancy, repositioned as neglect that justified betrayal. "So David comforted you by getting you pregnant?" "It wasn't planned, it just happened. These things happen, Ainsley. These things happen." Like adultery was a natural disaster, something that just occurred without anyone making deliberate choices. Like David had somehow accidentally impregnated a woman he couldn't actually impregnate. "I see. And you've been hiding this for 2 years, why?" "I wanted to protect you. I thought maybe David would tell you himself, or maybe it would be better if you never knew. But when he died, Michael deserves to know who his father was. He deserves his inheritance. The martyrdom was perfect. Clara, the noble sister, sacrificing her own comfort to protect me from a painful truth. Clara, the devoted mother, fighting for her son's rights against a selfish sister-in-law who wanted to keep everything for herself. "I need to think about this," I said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But Ainsley, I hope you'll remember that Michael is innocent in all of this. He's just a little boy who lost his father today." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me alone with her perfectly crafted narrative and my perfectly clear understanding of why it was impossible. The second call came from my mother an hour later. "Honey, I just spoke with Clara. This must be such a shock for you." My mother had apparently decided that Clara's version of events was factually accurate, which wasn't surprising. Throughout our lives, she'd consistently chosen to believe whichever daughter's story required less complicated emotional processing on her part. "It is a shock," I agreed. "She's trying to do the right thing for that little boy. I hope you can see past your hurt feelings and support your nephew. Your nephew. Not the child who may or may not be related to us, but your nephew." Clara had already won this battle in the court of family opinion. "I'm sure Clara told you her version of events. Ainsley, I know this is painful, but denial won't change the facts. That child needs his family now more than ever. Facts." As if Clara's accusations were established truth rather than claims that hadn't been verified. As if David's inability to defend himself made him automatically guilty of everything he was accused of. I thought about telling my mother the truth, about explaining that David couldn't have fathered any children, let alone Michael, about laying out the medical history that made Clara's story not just unlikely, but impossible. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the certainty that my mother wouldn't believe me. Maybe it was the knowledge that Clara would find a way to reframe even medical evidence as part of some elaborate cover-up. Maybe it was just exhaustion from a day that had already required more strength than I'd known I had. Or maybe it was strategy. Clara had chosen to make this a public battle, to announce her claims in front of an audience that would spread the story across our entire community. If I was going to fight back, I needed to do it right. I needed to make sure that when the truth came out, it would be as public and as definitive as her lies had been. "I'll call you later, Mom. I need some time to process everything." "Of course, sweetheart, but remember, family is family. Whatever mistakes David made, that little boy is still part of our family." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for another hour, thinking about Clara's phone call and my mother's assumptions and the way both of them had decided that the most generous interpretation of events was that my dead husband had betrayed me with my sister. It should have hurt more. The accusation of adultery, the assumption that I'd been too oblivious to notice an affair happening under my nose, the suggestion that David had been unhappy enough in our marriage to seek comfort elsewhere. But it didn't hurt because it wasn't true. And for the first time in my relationship with Clara, I had something she didn't, proof that she was lying. I went upstairs to David's office and opened the filing cabinet where we kept our important papers. Medical records, insurance policies, tax returns, the detritus of a shared life that continues generating paperwork even after one half of the couple is gone. At the bottom of the medical file, I found what I was looking for. David's surgical records from when he was 7 years old, the follow-up appointments that had continued into his teenage years. The fertility specialist's reports from 3 years ago confirming what David had already known. Impossible. Medically impossible for David to have fathered any children. I made copies of everything and put the originals back in the filing cabinet. Then I called James Morrison, the lawyer who'd handled our wills and estate planning. It was after business hours, but he'd given me his personal number when David died, telling me to call if I needed anything. James, it's Ainsley Richardson. I'm sorry to call so late, but I have a situation that can't wait. Of course. What can I help you with? I told him everything. Clara's announcement at the funeral, her phone call, her demands for David's assets, the medical impossibility of her claims. James listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes I could hear through the phone. This is clearly an attempt at fraud, he said when I finished. The question is whether she actually believes what she's saying or if she knows she's lying. Does it matter? For the legal case? Probably not, but it might matter for how we handle this strategically. If she genuinely believes Michael is David's son, she'll be more likely to push forward with legal action. If she knows she's lying, she might back down when she realizes you're prepared to fight. I want to fight either way. Good. Because based on what you've told me, this should be fairly straightforward to resolve. Paternity tests don't lie, and medical records don't lie. Your sister picked the wrong person to target with this kind of scam. For the first time since David's funeral, I smiled. Not because I was happy. I was still grieving my husband and reeling from my sister's betrayal, but because I finally saw a path forward that didn't require me to defend myself against accusations I knew were false. Clara had always won our battles because she fought dirty while I tried to be fair. She lied while I told the truth. She played victim while I accepted responsibility I didn't deserve. But this time was different. This time she'd told a lie that could be disproven with scientific evidence. This time, the truth was on my side in a way that couldn't be manipulated or reinterpreted or explained away. This time, I was going to win. Clara's lawyer was exactly what I expected. Expensive suit, practiced smile, and the kind of confidence that comes from representing people who usually get their way through intimidation rather than facts. We met in James's office 2 weeks after the funeral. Clara sat beside her attorney looking appropriately somber, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with tissues she'd brought specifically for the performance. I sat across from them with James, a stack of medical records, and the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're holding all the cards. My client has requested this meeting in hopes of reaching an amicable resolution, Clara's lawyer began. Ms. Richardson has legitimate claims to her son's inheritance, and we believe it's in everyone's best interest to handle this matter privately. Ms. Richardson. Clara was using her maiden name again, probably to distance herself from any association with David that might complicate her victim narrative. Smart, but not smart enough. What exactly is Ms. Richardson claiming? James asked. That the deceased, David Thompson, is the biological father of her 2-year-old son, Michael. She has documentation showing they had an intimate relationship during the relevant time period. I almost laughed. Documentation of an intimate relationship. What kind of documentation could possibly exist for an affair that had never happened? Love letters David hadn't written? Hotel receipts from dates that hadn't occurred? Photos of romantic encounters that existed only in Clara's imagination? What documentation? James asked. Clara's lawyer slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed text messages, photos, and what appeared to be a handwritten note. I recognized David's handwriting immediately, but the words were unfamiliar. Thank you for understanding. Last night meant everything to me. The message was dated 6 months before Michael's birth. Below it were text message screenshots showing conversations between David and Clara that I'd never seen before. Miss you already. Can't wait to see you again. You make me feel alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I know this is complicated, but what we have is real. My heart started racing despite my certainty that these messages were fabricated. They looked real, sounded like David's voice, referenced specific details that made them seem authentic. For a moment, I wondered if I'd been wrong, if somehow... But no, David couldn't have children. That was medical fact, not opinion or interpretation. Whatever Clara had done to create this evidence, it didn't change biology. James was examining the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of fabricated evidence. These are interesting, he said carefully. Of course, we'll need to verify their authenticity. They're authentic, Clara's lawyer said firmly. Ms. Richardson has also prepared a written statement detailing the relationship, including specific dates and locations. Clara leaned forward, her voice soft and emotional. I know this is painful for Ainsley. I never wanted it to come out this way. But Michael deserves to know his father, and he deserves his inheritance. David would have wanted that. The manipulation was flawless. Clara positioning herself as the reluctant truth-teller, forced to reveal painful secrets for the sake of an innocent child. Me cast as the selfish widow trying to deny a little boy his birthright. David transformed from faithful husband to cheating father who died before he could make things right. Ms. Thompson, Clara's lawyer addressed me directly, my client is prepared to be reasonable about this. She doesn't want to take everything, just what's fair for Michael. Perhaps we could arrange for a division of assets that reflects the child's needs while allowing you to maintain some security. How generous. Clara was willing to take only part of everything David and I had built together, leaving me with scraps of my own life as a gesture of sisterly kindness. What would Ms. Richardson consider fair? James asked. 50% of the life insurance proceeds, the house, since Michael should grow up in his father's home, David's personal effects, for sentimental value, and ongoing support for Michael's education and healthcare needs. Everything. She wanted everything, just phrased in terms that made it sound like a reasonable compromise. The house we'd renovated together. The life insurance meant to support me after David's death. Even David's personal belongings that held no value to anyone except me. That seems like quite a lot, James said mildly. Michael is David's only child, Clara's lawyer replied. In the absence of a will specifying otherwise, he would be entitled to inherit everything anyway. But David did have a will. A very clear, very legal will that left everything to me. The lawyer's phrasing suggested either he didn't know about the will, or he was hoping we didn't. Actually, James said, reaching for his own folder, Mr. Thompson did have a will. Very comprehensive, very clear. Everything goes to his wife. Clara's lawyer looked genuinely surprised. We weren't aware of a will. Of course, if there are children involved, wills can be contested. They can be, James agreed. But first, we'd need to establish paternity. I assume your client is prepared to submit to DNA testing? For the first time since the meeting began, Clara looked uncomfortable. I don't think that's necessary. The resemblance is obvious and we have documentation of the relationship. Documentation can be forged, I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken since the meeting began, and both lawyers looked at me with interest. DNA testing doesn't lie. Clara's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or fear. I can't believe you'd put Michael through that. He's just a baby, Ainsley. Your nephew. If he's my nephew, the test will prove it. Some things are more important than legal proof, like family. Like doing what's right for a child who didn't ask to be born into this situation. The emotional manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. Clara appealing to family loyalty after claiming my husband had betrayed me. Clara demanding I consider Michael's welfare after announcing his paternity at a funeral in front of 50 people. Clara asking me to do what's right, while demanding half of everything I owned based on lies. I think DNA testing is the most reasonable next step, James said diplomatically. It will resolve any questions about paternity definitively. Clara's lawyer whispered something to her and she nodded reluctantly. Fine, but I want it done through the court system with proper oversight. I don't want there to be any questions about the results. Absolutely, James agreed. Court-ordered testing is the gold standard. After they left, James and I sat in his office reviewing the documents Clara had provided. The text messages looked convincing, but James pointed out several inconsistencies in the metadata. The handwritten note was harder to evaluate, but he knew experts who could analyze the handwriting and paper. Even if everything is authentic, he said, it doesn't prove paternity. It would only prove your husband had some kind of relationship with your sister. He didn't, I said firmly. Whatever these documents are, they're not real. I believe you. But even if they were real, we have something better than character witnesses or emotional testimony. We have medical proof that your husband couldn't have fathered any children. I handed him the copies of David's medical records. He read through them carefully, his expression growing more confident with each page. This is ironclad, he said finally. Surgical sterilization at age 7 due to medical complications. Multiple follow-up appointments confirming complete sterility. Fertility specialist consultations during your marriage confirming the same thing. Your sister picked the wrong man to falsely accuse. What happens next? We file for court-ordered paternity testing. Given the medical evidence, I expect the judge will fast-track this case. Your sister will either withdraw her claims when she realizes she can't win, or she'll push forward and face the consequences of attempting fraud. What consequences? Filing false claims, perjury if she lies under oath, potentially fraud if she's accepted any money based on these allegations. Your sister has put herself in a very vulnerable legal position. For the first time since David's death, I felt something approaching peace. Not happiness. I was still grieving my husband and processing my sister's betrayal. But the calm certainty that comes from knowing the truth will eventually prevail. Clara had always won our battles because she was willing to fight dirty while I insisted on fighting fair. She was willing to lie while I told the truth. She was willing to manipulate emotions while I appealed to reason. But this time, reason was going to win. Science was going to win. Medical evidence was going to win. And Clara was going to learn that some lies are too big to sustain, no matter how good you are at telling them. Clara didn't back down after our meeting with the lawyers. If anything, she doubled down, like someone who'd bet everything on a losing hand but was too proud to fold. The phone calls started the next morning. First my Aunt Margaret, then Cousin Susan, then people I hadn't spoken to in years, but who'd somehow heard all the details of my family drama. "Ainsley, honey, I just heard about the situation," Aunt Margaret said, her voice dripping with the kind of false sympathy reserved for family scandals. "I know this must be so hard for you, finding out about David's indiscretions. Indiscretions. Like adultery was a minor social mistake, something embarrassing but forgivable. Like fathering a secret child was the equivalent of forgetting someone's birthday. I'm managing," I said. "Well, I hope you'll think about that poor little boy. He didn't ask to be born into this mess, and he shouldn't suffer because of adult problems. Adult problems. As if my refusal to hand over my house and life insurance to my sister was petty stubbornness rather than a reasonable response to obvious lies. "Michael is well cared for," I replied. "But is he really? Clara's struggling financially, and you know David would want his son to be provided for." Everyone had become an expert on what David would have wanted, despite the fact that David had left a clear legal will that expressed exactly what he wanted. But apparently, imaginary desires trumped actual documentation in the court of family opinion. The conversations followed the same pattern: expressions of sympathy for my situation, gentle suggestions that I was being unreasonable, and increasingly less subtle implications that I was a selfish woman denying an innocent child his birthright. Clara was conducting a masterful campaign, positioning herself as the reluctant truth-teller who only wanted what was best for Michael. She'd learned to frame every conversation in terms of the child's welfare rather than her own financial needs. "I don't want anything for myself," she told anyone who would listen. "This is about Michael knowing who his father was, and having the security David would have provided." The genius of it was that arguing against Clara meant arguing against a 2-year-old's interests. Anyone who questioned her story looked like they were punishing an innocent child for adult mistakes. My mother called every other day with updates on family sentiment, which was apparently running heavily against me. "People are concerned about your mental state," she told me on Thursday. "This kind of denial isn't healthy. Sweetheart, maybe you should talk to someone." Denial. The go-to explanation when someone refuses to accept a narrative that doesn't make sense. I wasn't processing grief appropriately, wasn't facing reality, wasn't handling the truth about my marriage maturely. "I'm seeing a therapist," I said, which was true. I'd started therapy after David died, not because I was in denial, but because losing your husband and discovering your sister's true nature in the same day required professional support. Good. I hope they can help you work through this. Clara feels terrible about how everything came out. She never wanted to hurt you. Clara felt terrible. Poor Clara. Burdened with secrets she never wanted to carry. Forced to reveal painful truths for the sake of her child. Clara the victim. Clara the reluctant messenger. Clara the devoted mother just trying to do right by her son. It was a perfect performance. And our family was eating it up. By Friday, Clara had moved on to more direct pressure. She showed up at my office during lunch, carrying Michael and looking appropriately harried. "Ainsley, we need to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk without being invited. "This legal stuff is getting out of hand." Michael looked around my office with the wide-eyed curiosity of a toddler in a new environment. Despite everything, seeing him still made my heart ache. Whatever Clara was doing, he was innocent in it. "What did you want to discuss?" "I want to settle this without putting Michael through a bunch of court procedures. He's too young to understand what's happening, but he can sense the tension. It's not fair to him." Clara had gotten better at this over the years, using emotional manipulation that was harder to argue against. How could I explain that court procedures were necessary without sounding like I cared more about legal technicalities than a child's emotional well-being? "Paternity testing is pretty routine," I said. "It won't be traumatic for him, but it's unnecessary. Look at him, Ainsley." She lifted Michael so I could see his face clearly. "Look at his eyes, his smile. He looks just like David." Did he? I studied Michael's features, trying to see what Clara claimed was obvious. He was a beautiful child with dark hair and warm brown eyes, but I still couldn't see any resemblance to my blonde, green-eyed husband. I think you're seeing what you want to see, I said gently. Clara's expression hardened slightly. I'm seeing what everyone else sees. Mom, Dad, Aunt Margaret, they all comment on how much he looks like David. You're the only one who can't see it. Or I'm the only one who knew David well enough to know this story is impossible. Nothing's impossible. Ainsley, people have affairs. Husbands lie to their wives. It happens every day. She was right about that. Affairs happened. Husbands lied. Marriages weren't always what they seemed from the outside. In most cases, Clara's story would be entirely plausible, even likely. But not in this case. Not with David. I'm not changing my mind about the paternity test, I said. Clara sighed, adjusting Michael on her lap. Fine. But when it comes back showing David is his father, I hope you'll remember that I tried to handle this quietly. I tried to spare everyone the embarrassment of a public legal battle. The confidence in her voice was almost impressive. She genuinely seemed to believe that DNA testing would support her claims, which meant either she was a better liar than I'd given her credit for, or she actually believed her own story. We'll see what the test shows, I said. After she left, I sat in my office thinking about her certainty, her willingness to push forward with legal action, her apparent confidence that scientific evidence would vindicate her claims. For a moment, just a moment, I wondered if I could be wrong, if somehow the medical records were incomplete, or the doctors had made mistakes, or David had lied to me about something he couldn't have lied about. But no, I'd seen the surgical records, the follow-up appointments, the fertility specialist reports. Multiple doctors over multiple years had confirmed the same thing. David was sterile, completely and permanently. Clara might believe her own lies, but biology didn't care about belief. Science didn't care about confidence. DNA testing would reveal the truth, regardless of who wanted what to be true. I just had to wait for Clara to discover what I'd known all along, that some lies are too big to sustain, no matter how convincingly you tell them. Clara filed her legal claim on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon, the entire family knew about it. She'd made sure of that, calling everyone to explain that she'd been forced to take legal action because I was being unreasonable about Michael's inheritance. The narrative was perfect. Clara, the struggling single mother, driven to court by a selfish sister-in-law who refused to acknowledge an innocent child's rights. Me, the bitter widow, clinging to assets that rightfully belonged to my husband's son. My phone started ringing immediately. Ainsley, what are you thinking? My father demanded, his voice tight with disapproval. This is going to tear the family apart. Clara filed the legal action, not me. Because you left her no choice. The child deserves his father's inheritance. Why are you making this so difficult? It was fascinating how quickly everyone had accepted Clara's version of events as established fact. David's alleged affair wasn't a claim to be investigated. It was simply something that had happened, something I needed to accept and move past for the good of the family. I'm not making anything difficult. I'm asking for proof before I hand over everything David and I built together. What more proof do you need? The boy exists, Ainsley. He's David's son. The circular logic was maddening. Michael existed. Therefore, he was David's son. Clara had made the claim. Therefore, it must be true. I was asking for evidence. Therefore, I was being unreasonable. My mother took a different approach when she called, focusing on family unity rather than legal rights. This is destroying our family, she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. Clara is beside herself. You're being stubborn, and that poor little boy is caught in the middle. The poor little boy will be fine regardless of what a paternity test shows. But why put him through it? Why put any of us through it? Can't you just do the right thing? The right thing. Everyone seemed to have strong opinions about what the right thing was. But nobody seemed interested in whether Clara's claims were actually true. By Wednesday, I'd heard from every relative in our family tree. Cousins who hadn't called in years suddenly had urgent opinions about my moral obligations. Aunts and uncles who barely knew David's name were certain he would have wanted me to support his son. The pressure was coordinated, relentless, and effective. If I hadn't known what I knew, I might have started to doubt myself. The certainty in everyone's voices, the unanimity of opinion, the consistent message that I was being selfish and cruel. It was the kind of social pressure that could make someone question their own reality. But I did know what I knew. And what I knew was that David couldn't have fathered any children, regardless of how many people believed otherwise. James kept me updated on the legal proceedings, which were moving faster than typical family court cases. The judge is treating this as a straightforward paternity question, he told me. Given your husband's estate and the child's age, they want to resolve it quickly. What does that mean for timeline? Court-ordered paternity testing should happen within the next 2 weeks. Results usually take another week or two after that. We should have a definitive answer within the month. A month. 4 more weeks of family pressure. 4 more weeks of being treated like the villain in Clara's drama. 4 more weeks of people assuming my husband had betrayed me with my sister, but also 4 more weeks until Clara's lies were exposed in a way that couldn't be argued with or reinterpreted. 4 more weeks until everyone who judged me would have to confront the fact that they'd been wrong. The hardest part was maintaining my composure when people who should have known better treated Clara's accusations as established truth. David's own brothers called to express their disappointment in my handling of the situation. David wouldn't want this kind of family conflict, his older brother Mark told me. He'd want everyone to get along, to do what's best for his son. Even David's family had accepted Clara's narrative without question, transforming my husband into an adulterer and father in their minds, despite having known him for 36 years. David left a will, I reminded Mark. If he'd wanted to provide for any children other than ours, he would have included that. Maybe he didn't know about the boy when he wrote the will. Maybe Clara didn't tell him she was pregnant. Everyone had become an expert in explaining David's motivations and choices, even though those explanations required them to believe he was someone completely different from the man they'd actually known. The worst call came from David's mother, whose voice was thick with tears when she spoke. "I just want to meet my grandson," she said. "I want to hold him and tell him about his father. Why are you keeping him from us?" "I'm not keeping anyone from anyone. Clara is free to maintain relationships with David's family, but she feels uncomfortable because of all this legal fighting. She thinks we blame her for the affair. We blame her for the affair. Not if there was an affair or assuming her claims are true, but taking it as a given that David had been unfaithful and that Clara was somehow a secondary victim in the situation. Mrs. Thompson, David couldn't have children. That's a medical fact. Honey, I know this is hard to accept, but sometimes these things happen. Men have affairs, and sometimes children result from them. It doesn't mean David didn't love you." Even David's own mother was more willing to believe her son had betrayed his wife than to consider that Clara might be lying. The weight of that betrayal, not just Clara's lies, but the family's willingness to believe them, was almost overwhelming. By Friday, I realized I was completely alone in this battle. Every single person who should have supported me, should have known me well enough to believe I wasn't being unreasonable, had chosen Clara's side instead. It was a masterful performance on her part. She'd managed to position herself as the victim while casting me as the villain, and she'd done it so skillfully that even people who'd known me my entire life were convinced I was acting out of spite rather than seeking truth. But being alone in this fight also clarified something for me. I wasn't just defending David's memory or protecting our assets. I was defending the principle that truth matters, that claims require evidence, that being family doesn't give someone the right to lie about the dead. And I was about to prove that no matter how convincing a lie might be, no matter how many people believe it, no matter how much social pressure supports it, biology doesn't lie. The truth was coming, whether Clara and my family were ready for it or not. Judge Patricia Morrison looked exactly like someone who'd been settling family disputes for 20 years. Patient but no nonsense. Kind but unimpressed by emotional theatrics. When Clara's lawyer started his opening statement with phrases like tragic circumstances and innocent child, she cut him off. "Counselor, this is a paternity hearing, not a custody battle. Do you have evidence that the deceased is the father of this child?" "Yes, Your Honor. We have documentation of an intimate relationship, witness testimony, and what I need," Judge Morrison interrupted, "is biological evidence. Everything else is speculation." I liked her immediately. After weeks of being subjected to Clara's emotional manipulation and family pressure, it was refreshing to sit in a room where facts mattered more than feelings. "Your Honor," James stood, "given that the alleged father is deceased, we request court-ordered genetic testing using archived medical samples." Clara's lawyer looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, subjecting a 2-year-old child to invasive testing procedures is standard procedure in paternity cases," the judge finished. "Mr. Davidson, surely you're familiar with genetic testing protocols." "Of course, Your Honor, but we believe the documentation we've provided clearly establishes—" "Mr. Davidson," Judge Morrison's voice carried the kind of authority that ended arguments immediately. "In this courtroom, paternity is established by DNA evidence, not by text messages or photographs. Do you have any objection to genetic testing?" Clara's lawyer whispered something to Clara, who was sitting rigidly in her chair, her face pale. From where I sat, I could see her hands trembling slightly. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Clara looked genuinely scared. "No objection, Your Honor." "Good. Given the deceased status of the alleged father, we'll use archived medical samples for comparison." "Mrs. Thompson," the judge addressed me directly, "I understand your late husband had medical procedures that would have resulted in tissue samples being stored?" "Yes, Your Honor. multiple procedures over several years. Mr. Morrison, she turned to James, please coordinate with the medical examiner's office to locate appropriate samples. I want this resolved quickly and definitively. The formal language couldn't disguise what was really happening. We were about to prove, using David's own DNA, that he couldn't have fathered Clara's child. The medical samples would confirm what his surgical records had already established, that my sister was lying. Your Honor, Clara's lawyer tried one more time. My client is prepared to accept a generous settlement arrangement that would avoid the trauma of invasive testing. Counselor, are you suggesting your client would prefer to settle rather than prove her case definitively? The question hung in the air like a trap. Clara's lawyer had essentially admitted that he'd rather avoid DNA testing, which made it sound like he wasn't confident in his client's claims. Not at all, Your Honor. We simply believe, then we'll proceed with testing. I'm ordering genetic analysis using archived tissue samples from the deceased to determine paternity of the minor child. Results to be submitted to this court within 14 days. 14 days. 2 weeks until Clara's lies were exposed in a way that couldn't be argued with, explained away, or reinterpreted as family dysfunction. After the hearing, James and I walked to his car while Clara and her lawyer huddled in intense conversation near the courthouse steps. I could see Clara gesturing frantically, her composed victim facade finally cracking under pressure. She looked nervous, James observed. She should be. She's about to be exposed as a fraud in front of a judge. The question is whether she actually believes her own story. If she genuinely thinks David is the father, she'll be shocked by the results. If she knows she's lying, she might try to withdraw the case before testing is complete. I thought about Clara's behavior over the past few weeks. Her confidence, her willingness to involve lawyers and courts, her apparent certainty that DNA testing would vindicate her claims. She believes it, I said. Clara has always been good at convincing herself that her version of events is reality. She's probably genuinely convinced that David is Michael's father. That might actually be worse for her legally. Fraud requires intent to deceive. If she genuinely believes her claims, she might avoid criminal charges. But she'll still be liable for court costs, legal fees, and potentially civil damages for defamation. We drove back to James's office in comfortable silence. For the first time in weeks, I felt something approaching peace. Not happiness. I was still grieving David and processing the magnitude of Clara's betrayal, but the calm certainty that comes from knowing the truth will soon be revealed. The medical examiner's office was efficient. Within 3 days, they'd located multiple tissue samples from David's various procedures over the years. Blood work from his annual physicals, tissue samples from a minor surgery 2 years earlier, even genetic material from dental work he'd had done 6 months before his death. Any one of those samples would be sufficient to establish paternity, or in this case, to definitively rule it out. The medical examiner would compare Michael's DNA to David's and produce a scientific answer that couldn't be disputed, misinterpreted, or explained away. While we waited for the lab results, the family pressure continued, but with less intensity. Maybe people sensed that the situation was moving beyond their ability to influence it, or maybe they were starting to have their own doubts about Clara's story. My mother called on Friday, her voice less certain than it had been in previous conversations. Honey, I've been thinking about all this, and I want you to know that whatever the test shows, you're still my daughter. It was the closest she'd come to admitting that Clara might be lying, though she still couldn't say it directly. After weeks of being treated like the family villain, even that small acknowledgement felt significant. Thank you, Mom. I hope Clara knows what she's doing. This kind of thing, if she's wrong, it could destroy relationships that can't be repaired, if she's wrong. The first time anyone in my family had entertained the possibility that Clara's claims might not be accurate. Yes, I agreed. It could. But those relationships were already destroyed, weren't they? Clara had destroyed them the moment she chose to lie about David at his funeral. The family had damaged them further by choosing to believe her lies without question, by pressuring me to accept claims I knew were false, by treating me like the villain in Clara's manufactured drama. The DNA test wouldn't repair those relationships. It would just make clear to everyone what I'd known all along, that Clara was exactly who she'd always been, and the family members who'd enabled her were exactly who they'd always been too. In 10 more days, we'd have scientific proof of what David's medical records had already established. Clara's lies would be exposed, her claims would be dismissed, and everyone who judged me would have to confront the fact that they'd been wrong. I was ready for that confrontation, more than ready. The waiting was the hardest part. 10 days for lab results that would either vindicate everything I'd said or destroy everything I believed about my marriage. Even though I knew what those results would show, the uncertainty was exhausting. Clara, meanwhile, seemed to be thriving on the suspense. She'd returned to her confident, martyred persona, telling anyone who would listen that she was nervous but hopeful about the test results. "I just want Michael to know who his father was," she told my mother, loud enough for me to hear during a family dinner I'd reluctantly attended. DNA doesn't lie, right? Science will prove what I've been saying all along. The irony was almost funny. Clara positioning herself as the champion of scientific truth, confident that DNA testing would support claims I knew were biologically impossible. She'd even started making plans based on her expected victory. Talk of redecorating David's house for Michael, discussions about which of David's belongings should be saved for when Michael was older, suggestions about how his college fund should be managed. David would want Michael to go to his alma mater, she told David's mother during one of their increasingly frequent phone calls. "I was thinking we should start saving specifically for that." David's mother, who'd been cool toward me since Clara's allegations began, was warming up to the idea of having a grandchild to spoil. She'd already bought Michael new clothes and toys and was talking about setting up a nursery in her house for visits. The whole family was building their lives around Clara's lies, making emotional investments in a relationship that didn't exist, and planning a future based on claims that would soon be disproven. Watching them do it was like watching people build sandcastles right before high tide. I tried to feel sorry for them. They were going to be disappointed and embarrassed when the truth came out. But after weeks of being treated like the problem, of having my character questioned and my motives doubted, I mostly felt a grim satisfaction that they were about to learn how wrong they'd been. James called on Thursday with an update from the lab. "Results should be ready tomorrow," he said. "Are you prepared for this?" "I've been prepared since the day Clara made her accusation. And if, somehow, the results aren't what you expect." I appreciated that he was being thorough, preparing for all possibilities even though we both knew what the DNA test would show. "They will be what I expect. David couldn't have children, James. That's not opinion or wishful thinking. It's medical fact. I believe you. I just want to make sure you're ready for whatever comes next. Win or lose, this is going to change your family relationships permanently." He was right about that. Whether the test proved me right or Clara right, we'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Clara had publicly accused my dead husband of adultery. The family had chosen her side over mine without waiting for evidence. I'd been willing to subject a 2-year-old to DNA testing, rather than accept claims I knew were false. These weren't the kind of conflicts families bounced back from easily. Someone was going to be devastated by these results, and someone else was going to be vindicated in a way that felt more like Pyrrhic victory than celebration. Friday morning, I woke up with the strangest feeling of anticipation. Not excitement, exactly, but the kind of focused energy that comes from knowing a long ordeal is almost over. Today, I'd finally have official proof of what I'd known all along. Clara had apparently felt the same anticipation. She'd called James's office twice before 9 a.m., asking if the results were ready yet. According to his secretary, she'd sounded excited rather than nervous. At 11:30, James called. "The results are in. Can you come to my office? Just tell me. I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you be here in an hour?" His tone was professional but careful, which made me wonder if there was something unexpected in the report. For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flutter of doubt. What if I'd been wrong? What if somehow? But no. I'd seen David's medical records, talked to his doctors, lived through years of fertility treatments and disappointments. There was no scenario in which David could be Michael's father. James was probably just being cautious, making sure we discussed the implications of the results before word got out. This was going to create a legal and family nightmare for Clara, and James wanted to make sure we handled it properly. I arrived at his office to find him sitting at his desk with a thick folder and an expression I couldn't quite read. "The DNA results," he said without preamble, "confirm what we expected. David Thompson is not and could not be the biological father of Michael Richardson." Even though I'd known it was coming, hearing it stated so definitively was a relief so intense it was almost physical. The truth. Official, scientific, uncontestable truth. "The lab report is very clear," James continued, opening the folder. "No genetic relationship whatsoever. The child could not be Mr. Thompson's son under any circumstances. What happens now? Now we go back to court. Clara's paternity claim is dismissed. Her request for inheritance rights is denied, and depending on how she wants to handle this, she could be facing charges for fraud, perjury, and defamation. Charges. I hadn't really thought about the criminal implications of what Clara had done. She hadn't just lied about David, she'd lied under oath, filed false legal documents, and attempted to claim assets based on fabricated relationships. Will she be arrested? That depends on whether the prosecutor's office wants to pursue charges and whether Clara continues to maintain her claims even after being presented with contradictory evidence. If she admits she was wrong and withdraws gracefully, they might let it go. If she doubles down or tries to claim the tests were wrong somehow, I knew Clara well enough to know she wouldn't withdraw gracefully. She'd maintained her innocence in the face of obvious contradictory evidence her entire life. DNA results wouldn't suddenly make her capable of admitting she'd been wrong. When do we go back to court? Judge Morrison scheduled a hearing for Monday morning to review the results. Clara's been notified, so she knows the tests are complete. It'll be interesting to see how she responds. Interesting was one word for it. Clara was about to discover that her confident predictions about DNA evidence had been completely wrong, that the scientific proof she'd claimed would vindicate her had instead exposed her as a liar, and that everyone who'd believed her story was about to learn the truth about what she'd done. After 34 years of watching Clara manipulate situations to her advantage, I was finally going to see her face consequences she couldn't talk her way out of. Monday couldn't come fast enough. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of weather that matches your mood when you're about to watch someone's lies finally catch up with them. I dressed carefully, professional but not celebratory, confident but not smug. This wasn't a victory I planned to gloat over. Clara was already at the courthouse when James and I arrived, sitting in the hallway with her lawyer and looking like someone who'd spent the weekend reconsidering her life choices. Gone was the confident victim persona she'd maintained for weeks. She looked pale, anxious, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, genuinely scared. When she saw me, our eyes met for just a moment. I expected to see anger there, or defiance, or at least the stubborn determination that had always defined her. Instead, I saw something I'd never seen in Clara before: complete defeat. She knew. Somehow, despite weeks of apparent confidence in her claims, she knew the DNA results had destroyed her story. Mrs. Thompson, Judge Morrison called us to order with her usual efficiency. I've reviewed the genetic testing results submitted by the medical examiner's office. Mr. Davidson, has your client been provided with copies of these results? Clara's lawyer looked like he'd aged 5 years over the weekend. Yes, Your Honor. We received them Friday evening. And does your client wish to maintain her paternity claim in light of this evidence? The silence stretched out for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Clara sat motionless, staring at her hands folded in her lap while her lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside her. Mr. Davidson? Your Honor, my client would like to withdraw her claim. On what grounds? More silence. Finally, Clara's lawyer spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. The genetic testing conclusively rules out paternity, Your Honor. There is no biological relationship between the deceased and my client's child. Judge Morrison looked at Clara directly. Ms. Richardson, do you understand that by withdrawing your claim, you're acknowledging that your previous statements to this court were inaccurate? Clara lifted her head for the first time since we'd entered the courtroom. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet the judge had to ask her to repeat herself. Yes, Your Honor. I was wrong. Wrong. Such a small word for such massive destruction. Wrong about David being Michael's father. Wrong about having evidence to support her claims. Wrong about being able to convince a court that her lies were truth. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Ms. Richardson, this court takes false claims very seriously. You filed legal documents asserting facts you couldn't substantiate. You made statements under oath that have been proven false by scientific evidence. Can you explain how this happened? Clara finally looked up, and I could see tears streaming down her face. Real tears this time, not the calculated emotional displays she'd used throughout this process. I convinced myself it was true. I wanted it to be true so badly that I believed it was true. Wanted what to be true? That Michael had a father. That David, her voice broke, that someone would take care of us. And there it was. The truth beneath all the lies, manipulation, and legal maneuvering. Clara hadn't been trying to destroy my marriage or steal my inheritance out of malice. She'd been desperate, financially and emotionally, and had convinced herself that David could solve her problems if only she could prove he was Michael's father. It was pathetic and sad and completely in character for my sister, who'd spent her entire life looking for someone else to fix her problems, instead of taking responsibility for her own choices. Judge Morrison's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Ms. Richardson, I understand that single parenthood is challenging, but fabricating paternity claims is not an acceptable solution to financial difficulties. Do you understand the serious legal consequences of what you've done? Yes, Your Honor. You've filed false legal documents. You've made statements under oath that were factually incorrect. You've caused significant emotional and financial harm to Mrs. Thompson during her period of grief. These are serious matters. Clara was crying openly now, no longer trying to maintain any pretense of dignity or control. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant. I just wanted. What you wanted? Judge Morrison interrupted. Was to claim assets that weren't yours based on relationships that didn't exist. The court will be forwarding this matter to the prosecutor's office for review of potential criminal charges. Criminal charges. Even though James had warned me this might happen, hearing it stated in open court was sobering. Clara wasn't just going to lose her false claim, she was going to face the possibility of jail time for what she'd done. Furthermore, the judge continued, Mrs. Thompson, you may wish to consult with your attorney about civil remedies for the defamation and emotional distress you've suffered. James leaned over and whispered, she's suggesting you can sue Clara for damages. Sue my sister. The thought had never occurred to me, but I supposed it made sense. Clara had publicly accused my dead husband of adultery, convinced our entire family that I was being unreasonable for questioning her claims, and put me through weeks of legal proceedings to defend myself against lies she'd known were false. Your Honor, I found myself standing. Though I hadn't planned to speak. May I address the court? You may. I looked at Clara, still crying in her chair, and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but a kind of exhausted sadness for both of us. She'd destroyed our relationship, damaged David's memory, and torn our family apart. And for what? A desperate fantasy that someone else would solve her problems. Your Honor, I don't want to pursue civil damages. I just want this to end. Judge Morrison studied me for a moment. Are you certain, Mrs. Thompson? You've suffered significant harm as a result of Ms. Richardson's actions. I'm certain. Clara will face whatever consequences the prosecutor decides are appropriate, but I don't need anything more from her. Because what could Clara possibly give me that would repair the damage she'd done? Money wouldn't restore David's reputation or rebuild the family relationships that had been shattered by her lies. A civil judgment wouldn't undo weeks of being treated like a villain by people who should have known better. The only thing I'd wanted was the truth, and now I had it. Official, court-documented, scientifically verified truth that Clara had lied about everything. Very well. Ms. Richardson's paternity claim is dismissed. All requests for inheritance or asset distribution are denied. This matter is closed as far as this court is concerned. Judge Morrison's gavel came down with a sound of finality that seemed to echo through the courtroom. It was over. Finally, completely over. Clara and her lawyer left immediately, not making eye contact with anyone. James and I gathered our papers and walked out of the courthouse into the gray morning light. How do you feel? He asked. I considered the question carefully. How did I feel? Not triumphant, exactly. Not happy. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Free, I said finally. I feel free. Free from Clara's lies. Free from family pressure to accept claims I'd known were false. Free from having to defend David's memory against accusations that had never been true. The truth had finally caught up with my sister, and it was exactly what I'd known it would be all along. 3 days after the court hearing, I was reorganizing David's office when I found the letter he'd written me, sealed in an envelope with my name on it, tucked inside his desk drawer behind some old tax returns. My dearest Ainsley. It began in David's familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, something has happened to me and you've needed to access our private documents. I hope it's many years from now, and that the medical information we've kept private has remained just that, private. But if someone has tried to use my death to hurt you, I hope these records help you defend yourself. I know how loyal you are to family, how much you want to believe the best about people you love, but you deserve to be protected from those who would take advantage of that beautiful heart of yours. Don't let anyone make you doubt what we know to be true. I love you beyond words, beyond time. Whatever happens, know that. David. I sat in his chair and cried for the first time since his funeral. Not for the marriage Clara had tried to destroy with her lies, but for the husband who'd known me well enough to prepare for the possibility that someone might use his death against me. David had understood that my loyalty to family could be weaponized, that my desire to believe the best about people made me vulnerable to manipulation. He'd left me the tools to protect myself while also reminding me that those same qualities, loyalty, faith in people, willingness to love despite disappointment, were strengths, not weaknesses. The phone rang while I was reading his letter for the third time. Ainsley? It was my mother, her voice tentative in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child. Could we talk? She came over that evening, carrying a casserole I didn't need and wearing the careful expression of someone who knows they need to apologize but isn't quite sure how to start. I owe you an explanation, she said, settling into David's favorite chair, about why I believed Clara so quickly. Mom, you don't... Yes, I do. Her voice was firmer than I'd expected. I failed you, Ainsley. As your mother, I should have known better. I should have asked questions instead of just accepting Clara's story. I waited for the excuse, the explanation that would make her choice to believe Clara understandable if not forgivable. But it didn't come. There's no good reason, she continued. Clara has always been dramatic. always been difficult. And you've always been steady, reliable, honest. If anyone in this family was going to lie about something this serious, it wouldn't be you. It was the acknowledgement I'd needed to hear but had stopped expecting. Not just that Clara had been wrong, but that the family's willingness to believe her over me had been a betrayal of everything they knew about both of us. "I'm sorry," my mother said simply. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you. I'm sorry I didn't ask better questions. I'm sorry I put you through weeks of defending yourself against lies." "Thank you," I said. Because forgiveness felt too complicated right now, but gratitude was simple and honest. We talked for 2 hours about Clara, about family patterns that had enabled her behavior for decades, about the difference between supporting someone and enabling their destructive choices. It wasn't everything. There were still years of dysfunction to unpack, but it was a beginning. After Mom left, I called James to ask about Clara's situation. The prosecutor decided not to file criminal charges, he told me. First offense, genuine remorse, and the fact that you declined to pursue civil damages worked in her favor. I was surprised by how relieved I felt. Clara had done terrible things, but she was still my sister and Michael's mother. Jail time wouldn't have served anyone's interests. What about Clara and Michael? As far as I know, they're fine. Clara's moved back in with your parents temporarily while she figures out her next steps. My parents were supporting Clara again, which was probably inevitable. But at least now they were doing it with full knowledge of who she was and what she was capable of, rather than enabling her out of blind faith in family loyalty. 2 weeks later, I had lunch with David's mother for the first time since the funeral. She looked older than I remembered, and tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I wanted to apologize," she said immediately, "for believing those awful things about David, for treating you like you were being unreasonable. You wanted to believe you had a grandchild. I understand that. That's not an excuse for doubting my son's character. Or yours." She reached across the table and took my hand. "David loved you completely. He never would have betrayed you, and I should have known that." We talked about David for an hour, not about the accusations or the legal battle, but about the man we'd both loved. His terrible jokes, his obsession with fixing things that weren't broken, his habit of leaving coffee cups in every room of the house. The real David, not the fictional adulterer Clara had created. "What will you do now?" she asked as we were leaving. It was a question I'd been asking myself for weeks. David's life insurance would let me live comfortably without working, but I was only 34. I had decades ahead of me to figure out who I was without him. "I'm thinking about going back to school," I said. "Maybe law school. Turns out I'm pretty good at research and arguing cases." She laughed, and for the first time in months, it felt normal to laugh about something. That evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and David's letter, thinking about the past few months and what they'd taught me about truth, family, and the difference between loyalty and enabling. Clara had tried to use David's death to solve her financial problems, destroying his memory and our relationship in the process. My family had chosen to believe her lies rather than ask difficult questions. I'd been forced to prove my dead husband's innocence against accusations I'd known were impossible. But through it all, the truth had remained the truth. David's medical records hadn't changed because Clara wanted them to be different. DNA testing hadn't lied because her story was emotionally appealing. Biology didn't care about family dynamics or financial desperation or the desire to believe the best about people. In the end, that's what had saved me. Not my loyalty to David's memory or my refusal to be manipulated, but simple, verifiable facts that couldn't be argued away. Clara was still my sister, and part of me hoped she'd learned something from this experience about the difference between wanting something to be true and making it true through lies. But even if she hadn't, even if she continued to be exactly who she'd always been, I knew now that truth doesn't require anyone's permission or belief to exist. It just is. And sometimes, that's enough. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-life stories about family, betrayal, and the power of standing up for truth even when everyone else chooses to believe convenient lies. Truth always wins in the end. It just sometimes takes longer than we'd like.